Thank you very much for joining us this evening at SGInnovate Presents Future of Mobility. Well, this event is being streamed on our Facebook page as well. So to those tuning in, thank you very much. And you can find us on our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, we're on there. And we have a YouTube channel as well. So a little more about SGInnovate. As a few of you might already know, we had just announced our Deep Tech Nexus strategy a while ago. So we aim to contribute to the deep tech ecosystem in two ways. The investment capital, where we aim to be one of the earliest investors in deep tech startups, and also through human capital, where we aim to build the talent pool and also connect this talent to the startups. And without further ado, before I introduce the panelists and invite them to the stage, let's watch a short video by the LTA.
Daddy, can we go faster, please?
Safety first, son.
Okay. When I'm older, going from one place to another will be much easier.
And will you drive me around in your car next time?
In the future, we won't need to own cars. Public transport will be the best way to get around. Buses, shuttles, and pods can drive themselves and they can take us anywhere we want. The best part is we can share these vehicles, so there will be fewer cars on the road. Which means that we don't have to waste space building car parks. Then all the space we save can be used to build playgrounds and parks right in the middle of our home. I'll have more space to play. Getting around Singapore will be so easy. We can call for a shuttle to pick us up anytime and anywhere. And it can take us where we want to go. The shuttles are so smart, they will always know what's coming up. They'll talk to one another and the traffic lights to make sure they drive extra safe. There are no fast vehicles in the town center, so we can walk or cycle to the transport interchanges. Once we're there, we can take the train or bus to other parts of Singapore. At night, we can take the small pods home. While we are sleeping, cleaning robots can help make our home beautiful again. And the big lorries Mommy always warns me about can come out without disturbing anyone. So Daddy, when I grow up, Singapore will look very different. The trains, buses, shuttles, and pods can drive themselves. They can pick us up and send us anywhere we want to go, all day and every day.
Okay, and now let me invite our moderator for the day, Michael Smith, the partner of SeedPlus, Doug Parker, the COO of nuTonomy, Shann from LTA, and also Annabella from Grab.
On. All right. Good evening. We've got a packed house. I think we're online as well. Hopefully that's working because I promoted it. So, all right. My name is Michael. I'm a partner at SeedPlus. We're a Singaporean seed stage venture capital firm. One of our LPs is actually SGInnovate. So that's the connection here. And this is a great topic because I don't know how many people commuted here. You didn't all walk, right? You can raise hands. It's okay. How many people actually commuted here, right? So I think it's going to be a great topic because everybody's dealing with commuting all the time, right? And I think at the same time, we're all here as, you know, nerds and people looking at tech and how that's going to change commuting and change just how the city works. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, name and kind of what you work on so we can kind of set the tone, and then we'll jump in and start asking some questions. We'll start with Doug.
Hi, my name is Doug Parker. I'm the COO of nuTonomy. I came to Singapore about 3 years ago, actually to take advantage of this opportunity. nuTonomy was a startup spun out from MIT and locally here from SMART that's focusing on autonomous vehicles. And so we've been building autonomous vehicles as researchers for 10 plus years, now really getting them on the road and trying to figure out how to engineer, develop, and actually commercialize them. So taking the drivers out of the loop at some point in the near future.
LTA? Yeah.
Hi, hello, I'm Shann from LTA. I look after the technology and industry development group in LTA. And prior to this, I am heading the Futures Division in Ministry of Transport. Autonomous vehicles is one of the projects that MOT, LTA are aggressively pursuing, and happy to take some questions later.
Hi everyone, my name is Annabella and I'm Government Affairs Head at Grab. Grab, as you know, is a ride-hailing company in Southeast Asia, and you must have booked our services at some point, whether you're traveling in Southeast Asia or in Singapore. And in Grab, I work on our government relations and on regulatory issues with the Singapore government, but also on larger public affairs and social impact initiatives.
My name is Mahesh Tanwani. I'm Engineering Director for Automated Driving for Aptiv. We used to be called Delphi, so now we are Aptiv. Aptiv is just maybe short introduction because Aptiv is new, just newly born a few months back. Basically, it's renamed from Delphi. It's a technology company that provides safe, green, and more connected solutions for the future of mobility.
Great. Okay.
And our new buddies.
Yeah, I was going to say. Like,
Sorry?
Our new friends.
Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe let me add that Aptiv acquired nuTonomy just a couple of months back, so we are now brothers. Yeah.
It doesn't look right that we're sitting so far apart.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? It looks like we don't
True.
like each other.
Church and state, buddy. Church and state. Yeah, we should give an applause here for another exit in Singapore. I get really tired of that. When Singapore are going to create some exits, and then we create these exits, huge ones, and then no one talks about it. So it's kind of baffling. So, all right. So I think if we were doing this in other cities, this conversation would be very different, right? But I think, coming from the vantage point here of not talking about all of Asia or all of metropolitan cities, because they're all very different. But I think Singapore is kind of unique for a couple factors, right? One is the public transit system is probably one of the best in the world, right? If you've lived in other parts of the world, you would know that that's a fairly fair statement. I think second is the government's really actively involved in planning what the future of the place looks like. And I know in some countries you'll go and they'll take you to this room and you'll see a model of the city that never gets built. But in Singapore, they're actually working on it. So, and I'll admit, I'm a Singapore fanboy, so I can get slapped around later. But then the other thing is, I think if you look at the way the city's been built out and kind of the planning around, the public infrastructure and the private infrastructure kind of coming together in some sense is kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. So given all this, I'm going to start with kind of a daring question, but just if you sit and look from your vantage point, each of you, as where you are today, there's a lot of talk about autonomous vehicles. There's a lot of talk about the transit system. But, when I sit on bus 92 out where I live, what I see is a packed bus in the morning, a bunch of empty buses in the afternoon. It's not amazing per se, but it's transportation. And then I deal with the peak Grab times and the peak Uber times and all this stuff. So 2 years from now, let's not go too far in the future. 2 years from now, what do you think it's going to look like? We'll start with Doug and just work our way down.
Well, certainly within 2 years, I think you're going to see some very big expanded trials of commercializing autonomous vehicles. I think that's going to start to get people really excited about the possibilities. I don't think people have really thought through the hundreds of ways that this is going to impact life, whether it's Singapore or Topeka or New York City or Paris. I think people haven't internalized how much this is going to change how we live on a day-to-day basis, the way it's taken 10 or 20 years for people to figure out, wow, Amazon's really changing everything about our lives. I think this is going to have a similarly broad impact on how we live.
And do you mean that from the perspective of public transit will dramatically change in 2 years, or you'll think you'll just see a lot more autonomous tests going on throughout the whole island.
Well, I'll let Shann talk about how much public transit's going to change in
All
the
right.
next 2 years. But I think, people say we overestimate what we can do in 2 years, but underestimate what we can do in 10 years. I think it's very true about autonomous. We've come a long way in 2 years, but there's still a long way still to go in terms of research, testing, and actually how we commercialize it. That said, I think you're going to start to see some very credible deployments and testing, and pretty soon people are going to really start to believe that, yeah, this is the future. My kids don't need to get driver's license. I don't need to buy a car. This is coming.
And is this still one of the biggest cities you have testing going on in Singapore, or compared to?
Yeah, so as Aptiv, I think we can talk about as Aptiv, we are testing in a number of cities around the world: Las Vegas, Pittsburgh, Boston, Singapore, some others that we haven't announced yet, and really starting to look at how to commercialize. I think Singapore is maybe where we have some of the deepest collaborations with government.
Okay, great. Shann?
Well, maybe just to set some context, and from the government standpoint, we look at autonomous vehicles in a way of not just replacing one form with another. So we are excited on autonomous vehicles technology because we feel that this technology could help us address some of the national challenges. In Singapore, we have not a lot of land, just over 700 square kilometers. And to push ahead, we can't keep on adding roads and additional length of roads. We are already taking 12% as compared to, for road infrastructure, as compared to 14% for housing. And so, the future mobility is not one where we want to cater for diverse growing populations by growing a lot more road infrastructure. And so autonomous vehicles can play its part as part of the public transport. So on one hand, we are aggressively expanding our rail network because we need large capacity people mover system to move a very tidal morning and evening peak, people from one point to another very quickly. And so a train of about carrying capacity of 1,500 can easily move large number of people across. But autonomous vehicles can play a very crucial part as well. For example, the first and last mile. In this weather, and basically giving options to commuters to decide how they want to commute from one place to another, and they can fulfill this critical gap, first and last mile. And also, for higher capacity autonomous vehicles, it can also play a fixed and scheduled route during peak hours, or mobility on demand off-peak period. And that's where we probably do not need empty bus still plying the fixed and scheduled routes during off-peak period. And so these are some of the concepts that we are going to trial with our partners on our own, just to realize how the technology can fit into a larger public transport system.
So in 2 years, will I be stepping onto an autonomous bus?
You'll probably see a few more autonomous vehicles being trialed, but more importantly, I think the key part is not just about the technology. From the government standpoint, public acceptability is very important as well.
Sure.
Regulations is another key enablers to enable this ecosystem. I think pushing the technology is best left for industry like my friends here, whereas for the government to lay a very strong foundation and also to articulate, well, especially for Singapore, our vision, how to deploy the technology to serve our people better.
Got it. Grab, 2 years.
So I think I would like to pick up on a point that you made in your introduction, which is in Singapore, you have this great public transport infrastructure and network, and at the same time, you have all these private vehicles. And so far, Grab has been playing in the private vehicle space. We have been great at rolling out a whole range of services, taxi, private hire cars, carpooling, shuttle, you name it. But the real breakthrough for us in transport will happen when we can integrate our services in a cohesive way with the public transport system. And our vision for that is one where any commuter can be in a single journey using multiple modes And these would cut across Grab services as well as the public transport network. And I think if you think about the dividends to be reaped from that, the potential is enormous. From a public transportation service, you can create greater efficiency and reduce congestion. For instance, now for every office worker going to work in the CBD, do they really need to be taking a taxi or car from their home to the office? It might be more efficient to be dropped off at an MRT station just outside the fringe and avoid ERP and take the last part of the journey in by the MRT. And also from a consumer perspective, that would really be able to help us realize gains in providing our customers with the best value for their buck. Because if you think about combining all these modes, we can really bring down the cost of a journey tremendously. And where does Grab see autonomous vehicles fitting into this? I think for sure, we know that this technology is coming. It's inevitable. Since 2016, we worked with nuTonomy on a public trial. But to address, I think, the elephant in the room, we don't see a future where there would be 100% autonomous vehicles replacing all our human drivers. I think the future for us will likely be a mixed fleet where we can have autonomous vehicles complementing our human drivers in a great way. And for instance, what Shann mentioned, first and last mile trips, that's a really great use case for us because right now, one of the biggest complaints we get from drivers are these short distance trips. And even customers might face this problem. They're booking a short distance ride. The driver doesn't want to pick them up because he doesn't think that a journey is worth the time that he spends driving on the road for that. So I think there's really great ways in which we can bring this technology in to solve existing problems that we're facing and at the same time create better efficiency gains for the system as a whole.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that autonomous can help with as well is essentially the autonomous car doesn't care if it's going a short distance or going out to Tuas where there's no fare back. With a mixture of autonomous and human-driven cars, you can start to optimize the system as a whole versus the individual driver or the individual car.
I don't know which one this. It makes sense. 2 years.
Yeah, actually 2 years. So while Doug, Shann, and now were answering, I was thinking everything has been covered by these three people. But actually, I'll go maybe a little different route here. We started our journey maybe a little more than 2 years, maybe 3 years, 2015, as an organization, and we did coast-to-coast drive in US, from California to New York, 3,400 miles, 9 states, 15 days it took to ride that much distance. It was 99% time in autonomous mode. From there, we took it to the next CES. I don't want to go to intermediate steps because there's too much of information overload here. But we just did it in CES 2018, where we took it to the next level or next scale, where we demonstrated end-to-end solution of autonomous mobility on demand, where we put 8 vehicles on the road on Las Vegas streets, around 30 miles of a distance, and 20 destinations that user can pick and choose where they want to go. From point A to B or A to D, they can decide. And we did that just a month before. And the rating of that ride by Lyft was 4.997 out of 5. So I think I'm just telling you.
So the driver got a good star.
Journey in 2 or 3 years. The journey in next 2 to 3 years, space is so dynamic that it's hard to visualize or even imagine. But I think what we will do is we will work with team like Shann here, because it's not just the technology, but other pieces like just Shann mentioned, acceptance by the customers, regulations, legal aspects of it, the insurance and everything. So I think we will probably go go to the next level for sure from here to the next 2 years. Yeah.
So I think if you look at the whole range of mobility options, right, and you saw this happen with the craziness around bike rentals. I don't call them bike sharing, I call them bike rentals. So you look at the craziness around that, then you look at the people stepping on their electric scooters, and some are on the sidewalk, some are on the street, and there's even been some fairly famous accidents now of someone ramming a person on a scooter, and then you look at the normal roads, which frankly, I think once the robots get good at driving, I'd prefer those over humans any day. How's this all gonna get ratified? Because it can't just be that everybody gets thrown together on the current road and sidewalk system, and then somehow it's all gonna come out, because I expect a lot of pain if that's the way it's done. So do you think there's some model where some of the roads are gonna have to be taken back and saying this is autonomous lanes only, this is personal mobility machines only? You know, what's gonna be the way to get from A to B, knowing that if all this stuff gets dumped into the same routes that we see today, I sense a lot of chaos.
Chaos, that's your specialty, right? Order from chaos.
Well, from our standpoint, we were very clear. In Singapore, we couldn't quite afford segregated roadways for autonomous vehicles. And so we set out to look at technology solutions that can offer mixed-use traffic. The autonomous vehicles will need to fly in a mixed-use environment. And we're also looking at infrastructure-like kind of solution. And that's because we need to sustain this. It is not about delivering 1 or 2 autonomous vehicles, but we are looking at public transport service, and so we need to sustain the reliability, we need to sustain the scale, the number of vehicles that can be on the road to service the people. And so we are working with our partners to see whether from a technology standpoint, the vehicles are able to negotiate in a mixed use. Human drivers and autonomous vehicles all coexisting at the same time.
But you did make a conscious decision to cap the level of cars that can now enter the total space, right?
Yes.
Which is something,
Yeah.
I don't know of any other city in the world that's done this, right? So that was one move to pare down the numbers almost, right?
We look at the growth of vehicles as a need to help make sure that the goods and people are able to move around without too much congestions. But at the same time, dedicating a lane, for example, for autonomous vehicles to move from one place to another whole of country will require a lot more land in order for us to deliver that. And at this point in time, we are not looking at that kind of solutions. And so what have we done? In order to help spur R&D and also the eventual deployment of such autonomous vehicles, we set up test areas. And so many of you would know, in fact, our friends here in nuTonomy and Aptiv, they're all trialing at this place, the One North Business Park. It is relatively light traffic. It is mixed use. You have all kinds of traffic situation, jaywalkers, traffic junctions, non-signalized junctions, but scooters, what we call personal mobility devices, and pedestrians and all. So in this area, the technology developers are able to test their vehicles and improve on the technology. But bit by bit, we can then push the envelope in terms of how the autonomous vehicles can deploy. Our interest is to make sure that it is a safe environment. And so what we have done, before any vehicles can be put on this kind of mixed-use testing or test site, we conduct tests. Together with traffic police, we conduct tests to make sure that the autonomous vehicles is able to operate. We work with our partners or with any test developer, put in a safety driver in the meantime, so that if there's any intervention needed, these safety drivers could quickly take control of the vehicles. And I think I'll let the technology developers here share a little bit more. So what I'm trying to say is, we are very clear how are some of the deployment concepts be like. And we like to test them. And we invite technology developers to work with us. And what we in return would provide is to accept a certain risk that is managed so that everyone can progress as quickly as possible.
Maybe if I add to it, I think dedicated lanes are basically not a sustainable or practical solution for overall, I think from technology's perspective. Maybe one part of the city can be done, or maybe one small city state can do it. But I think that as a technology providers, we are not looking at that kind of solution space. Yeah? So we have to meet the challenges head on and get to a solution that can work with requirements that just now Vishan has stated. Yeah?
I think I would also like just to add to that as well. Any changes in infrastructure is difficult because infrastructure by itself is permanent, immutable. I think that's also where, you know, there can be some creativity brought in to think about how you can use data, for instance, about traffic conditions to manage road use and flow in a better way. And I think, you know, we are only just now starting to scratch the surface of what is possible. I think if you look at some examples around the world, China is somewhere where they have made really great advances. Didi, which is the ride-hailing counterpart in China, has done some amazing things around directing their drivers towards certain roads in order to avoid and manage congestion better. And they even work with city governments to, for instance, on large highways, to switch lane users quite flexibly throughout the day depending on traffic conditions. So I think when LTA also rolls out the new ERP2 system, that's when a lot of information that is right now only within the government's oversight can be pushed out to motorists all around the island. And with that, you know, you can start to see more creative users around maybe directing traffic and even road use.
So when you looked at the video, like one of the things I feel like today we're kind of looking at a gradual evolution, right? You guys are taking normal cars, filling the trunk with computers, and then controlling these things. And then the buses are still, and trains are fairly normal. Like, you know, I envision, you know, and today my relationship might be with Grab because that's the consumer app I'm used to ordering, or Uber, but I feel like when there's some level of like level 4 autonomous vehicle capability and it's been green lighted for fairly wide island use, it seems like all bets are off for the current incumbents, whether they be a bus or Grab, are necessarily best suited for a new world where it's just a vehicle I'm ordering. It may not even look like the ones I look like today, so that I can get in it and go somewhere at some cost that's, you know, is it the government going to be the one that best provide that? Is it private? Or do you think this is where you could potentially be looking at a whole new world, so to speak? And that's the one that it's really hard for me to put a finger on, but I feel like it's possible.
Yeah, I think from what we've seen is a lot of companies getting very excited about the changes coming, and there's a lot of opportunities. I think the old automotive companies are waking up to this and realizing that this is going to transform their business. I think there's a lot of new entrants that are thinking, okay, this is our time to shine. Someone told me that 65% of all Ubers were Toyotas. And we think about when people start to shift from personal ownership to a shared car, you know, the choices they're making, I'm not going to spend double to ride in a, you know, slightly nicer car, whereas I'm happy to spend, you know, $40,000 on a car in America versus $20,000 on a car. I think that's going to start to really sharpen people's attentions. I don't think there's going to be 50 automotive suppliers. I'm not sure if we're going to have Protons in the future and all of these other cars that I think we'll probably have 5 or 10 big makers that can afford to invest in the research, invest in partnerships.
Whether it be a traditional car or something built just for fleets.
Yeah, I think we're going to start to see a lot of new formats of cars. I can't say too much about that, but I think most of us are working on a new format as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. What you might see in future, the cars will look very different from what we are used to see nowadays. Um, it will have different user experience, and it has to communicate to all parts, like we call it V2E or V2X. Yeah, V to everything, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to pedestrian, vehicle to infrastructure. So for example, if you are crossing the street, normal maybe you see in the look towards the eyes of the driver and you see, okay, at least driver has seen me. But in the autonomous vehicle, you need some sense to see, okay, vehicle has acknowledged me that I'm still going to walk and cross the pedestrian walk. So I think there will be a lot of things that will be different, even HMI, human machine interface, and communication. So I think the vehicle space also is going to be different. Can we imagine vehicle without steering and brake and without rear view mirrors and all that? Hard to imagine now, but I think that will become reality soon.
I think that's also where people start to think about the economics changing, about how this works. So if we continue on that, one of the things that I think is not talked about a lot, and I'm curious how people feel about it, is kind of the role of safety and what's going to happen in tech and in security. Because I think about where this is all going. It's essentially an operating system on wheels. So, when my iPhone does something crazy, no one really gets harmed in the making of that, but I can imagine a vehicle, it didn't see me at the crosswalk, it ran me over. How is the government, I guess, at the top thinking about this, but at the same time, as vendors and people running a service, it must be running through your minds that as you tease more and more of the people out of the driver's seat, what is the role of kind of safety and technology specific to that?
Well, certainly there are quite a number of new areas that we have to be very mindful and constantly work on. First, safety is paramount. Safety is something that we have a very strong interest to make sure that all vehicles, whether is it public transport or private transports, if it's on the public roads, it has to be safe. And well, although we are talking about autonomous vehicles, we don't need to look so far ahead. Even at the current rate, we are seeing vehicles getting connected more and more. There are a lot more software, electronics being deployed in the vehicles, and there's certain amount of security and safety needed on these new areas. And as the vehicles not just get connected to one another as a fleet, but also talk to the infrastructure, as what Mahesh mentioned about V2E, vehicle to everything, then we do need to quickly also respond in terms of what is required. Today's testing is largely on the mechanical parts, on certain components, but perhaps we need to work a bit harder in terms of when the vehicles get connected with another, what's the X, vehicles or infrastructure. How could we manage that? Today, there are not that many standards, if there's any, that governs, say, cybersecurity of vehicles and so on. And that's where we really need to rally. I don't think authorities know everything.
Yeah, I'm sure the government
So
can't
that's
fix
where
this.
we have to work together. There's a lot of opportunities for startup, for industries to respond to that. And for us, our interest is always the safety of our people, not just the commuters taking the transport, but also the road users, and how we could make it safe, but at the same time, encourage very good movement of goods and people across the country.
Maybe I can add from technology providers' standpoint on this. Safety is, of course, the paramount number one priority for everyone. And when you design, you need to build in safety. Now, and as we all know, things will fail. And it's not a question of if, but it's when only. So we need to have a fault tolerant system where basically redundancy is in place. if one thing goes wrong, we have a redundancy to take care of the things. For example, in our systems, we have a controller. We call it multi-domain controller. It's a computing platform that takes care of autonomous drive computing. But we have to think, what if it goes, it fails? Because one day, out of some ppm level, parts per million, things are going to fail. So we have a redundant controller. We have an infotainment controller that takes over the control in case the main controller fails. But then the question comes is, what happens to infotainment services? If that takes over the additional job, who does its job? We have to really do the workload, and we say, okay, the full user experience that we are getting from infotainment system, in such case, the services will be limited to the critical services of infotainment system. So basically, we have to have a kind of fault tolerance system, and that we call it functional safety in technical terms, and also added cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, I think, is the biggest threat that we all are seeing is becoming real now. So we see use cases, it has happened. So for cybersecurity also, we have a strategy to deal it with all different layers, because chain is as strong as its weakest link. So any part, like for example, your access could be through Wi-Fi or Bluetooth that you are using in the simple vehicle. So you need to secure right from all the surfaces that attack could take place to the bottom where you build a hardware, you build a controller, you put the chip. When you select a chip, there are different kinds of chips are available, but you select a chip, we call it ball grid array. So those who are technical will know BGA package. Even the manufacturer, we can't access all the pins of it, even if I have a controller with me, until I break it apart. So we have to have the safety built into design, right from hardware to the coding practices that we use, to the software that basically executes and does checks and balance every moment. So we need to have a multiple layer of checks and balances to ensure the system is safe.
I think to add on, I fully agree with what everyone is saying here. I mean, the stakes for us are high, and every one of us have an interest in making sure that this succeeds. And the crucial thing is really public acceptance. Any single one incident can totally derail any progress that the technology has made and push us back again by years. So I think all parts of the ecosystem, regulators, industry, whether it's technology providers or operators, must work really closely with the government and in making sure that when we roll out and deploy such services, that we'd have done our absolute best to prevent any incident from happening.
Yeah, the standards are going to be much higher for us, but on the other hand, there's 1 million people dying a year in automotive accidents. That's something like 10 747 airplanes crashing every day around the world. I can't think of any other industry that kills more people or kills more of its consumers than automotive.
Yeah,
Maybe
this is why
smoking.
I say, let the robots drive, please.
Absolutely, and still you get into ride-hailing company's car, whichever it is, there's still some people in that shouldn't be driving, They haven't gotten weeded out yet. And I think what we have the opportunity to do is provide a much more consistent, much safer experience once it's mature. And I think there's a real fear of what's going to happen when someone gets hurt in an autonomous car. We're going to take responsibility. We've had an accident, we took responsibility for that. What we're seeing actually now in America is a lot of these companies are having more accidents as they drive more, and there hasn't been a major public outcry. I think people realize that, okay, there's going to be accidents, but on the other hand, the system overall should be much safer. I think the fear is when you have an integrated system, if 2/3 of all cars in the Grab network are Aptiv-powered cars, that's a state actor or a malicious actor could really do some harm. the failures might not be one or two accidents that add up to 1 million deaths a year.
Sure.
It could be something big. And
No, I mean, and obviously, like what I think it was last calendar years, right? There was no deaths by airplane, commercial jet liner
It's
deaths
amazing.
for 1 year is a world record. I mean, obviously, in 1 week in some city, more people died in normal car accidents. So I've always been kind of baffled why people don't think this is a better way, that, you know, the human isn't better. I mean, look what's happened with planes. They're mostly flown by computer with a human backing them up, and they just don't crash like they used to, right?
one, it's not just that the computers are doing a lot of the work. There's just so much incentive. Every plane accident is scrutinized. It gets so much bad press.
Yeah.
Likewise, you know, Tesla has 1 or 2 bad accidents, and it's really scrutinized across the
Yeah.
world. So we just hold ourselves to very high standards, and
Yeah,
you know,
the same will happen in
we've
this
got the
regard.
incentives to make this the safest, most comfortable,
Yeah.
best ride that you get in.
Yeah. So I say bring on the robots. All right, so we don't want to lose the audience in this, so let's try to open it up to questions. I think we got a mic to go around, or take my mic.
Hello. I'd like
Go
to
ahead,
ask.
introduce yourself. So
Sure.
people know.
My name is Hao. I work for a hedge fund, so I'm basically very interested in looking at this space. And I like ask a question about the industry dynamics. What I see is like globally we're selling about 100 million cars every year. That's roughly about 3-4 trillion US dollar kind of market we are looking at. And most of these market is actually basically the revenues for the OEMs, basically the car manufacturers we see from each country. And currently we see into autonomous driving these new whatever potential trends. That's there are two other forces coming. One is the fleet management, like Grab and Uber, basically managing different cars and trying to make optimized whatever transport out of it. And that's grabbing some, I would say, revenues out of it. And another is pure technology companies like Baidu or Google, some other companies. Basically, they don't manufacture cars in general. So, and they're trying to understand, maybe say, in the 5 to 10 years, would these three different, I would say, parties more likely to work together, or they're going to be totally separated? And I'm not sure, making an analogy like airplane industry is basically you got two basic manufacturers, right? They use the same standards of autonomous driving for all the planes, essentially. And that's basically only one standard. And technology is just one single provider. So I'm not sure whether that's something that we're going to see in the future, or is going to be different.
I think airlines are a great analogy because it's not just two companies. There's actually many manufacturers, it's a whole ecosystem, from the airlines, the aircraft manufacturers, the airline engine manufacturers, and all the companies that provide services into them. I think we'll see a lot more of this ecosystem starting to partner up. I don't think it's going to be just one company providing all of it. I think, you know, for our own plug, Aptiv was really the first company to put radars on cars. I think we're in a unique position to really industrialize the technology, which is, I think that's what we're all struggling with. This is a great research product. How do I make 100 million of them a year, and how do I make it safe?
Yeah, I think just to augment on that, I think the space will have new entrants. Like anytime the disruption takes place, there is the opportunity to leapfrog. Yeah, so we see that kind of scenario as well could happen. There are OEMs who are also getting into autonomous space, and I think they are leading. For example, GM, yeah, and Mercedes. I think they are doing quite well. There are also like tier ones who are basically getting into this space and providing key technology for autonomous vehicles. There are mobility providers are also getting into that. So you might see a kind of a mix of all this stuff getting into in the future.
I have a question specifically on cybersecurity. My background is cybersecurity. So please be very technical and very detailed. Thank you. So in
You might have the wrong
2016,
panel for that, but
sorry?
we'll do our best.
Oh yeah, you have already done your best. So this is even better, okay? So in summer 2016, I personally witnessed car hacking. from opening a car door to getting the whole chaos along a highway that every car can, one car get hacked and the rest of the traffic suffers along the highway. This hacking is actually very simple, at least to us, okay? So you can do things like I disable your window from opening or your door, or getting your heating system or cooling system doesn't work when you need it most. So such like things. So as the security landscape is changing, hacker is 3 steps ahead of you. There are a lot of things you can do for this kind of hacking. I shall not mention some of the very interesting way to do this. So my question to you is, what kind of PT that you do before you actually launch it to the public? Because, and also the other thing, because it's so energy dependent, so what kind of a SCADA backup do you have? So that when something goes wrong to your very heart, the grid, then what do you do with it? And what kind of tests you have carried out in the most serious way? Like in Tokyo, they do this because of 2020 Olympics. They actually carry out this in due diligence almost every month. They do this for those routes that is very important. So in Singapore, it's a very small place. So what you need is like one highway get into this. I shan't mention the rest of it, okay? Thank you.
That's a tough one. I want to add to this before they answer that actually there's a lot of research going on this in Interpool. So a lot of people don't know Interpool's cybersecurity lab is actually in Singapore. That's that cool building you see at the end of Orchard. And they have a whole group that's actually already looking at how they're going to support the police forces and the government in dealing with what they see as the future, which is essentially an operating system on wheels. And there will be accidents. There'll also be deliberate hacking so that I can run over my ex-wife with somebody else's autonomous vehicle. And then they'll have to figure out, was that actually a hack and somebody did want to kill somebody versus an accident? So Interpool actually is already trying to wrap their heads around this, but it's, I don't think it's an easy way to answer it today. Well, I think what they're trying to figure out is that, and they're trying to work with the tech companies to say that, like, look, you're going to have to, the system's going to have to describe what happened. And there's always been some fights with Tesla about this, and Google, I think, in the States, that, they can say, hey, this happened. They don't have to say what the brain was doing to make that decision, but where Interpol is trying to force the hand, and I think they're working with the government on some of these, is they want to have to force the tech companies that the computer will have to say why it did what it did, so that they can back out and figure out that it was an accident, it was malicious, it was a hack, right? So I think this whole space, honestly, it's way too new to have a very simple answer to this, but I know it's something they have to think about, but I think the governments are going to also be looking at some of this because people have to be held accountable, right?
I'll try to be as technical as possible in this, yeah? So excuse me for those. Okay, I think cybersecurity, first of all, is one biggest threat that we all have, not only for autonomous vehicles, for in general. The moment you are hooked up to internet or any media, you are vulnerable to that. What we do is, as I said, we built in this into design and try to make it incrementally difficult at every step. We have a 4-level of security strategy. And if you allow me, I'll give you a little lengthy response on this. Am I allowed? Okay. No, I think I'll try to limit. So, as I said, first is the most vulnerable thing. Most of the time, if you see, since you are in that space, you will acknowledge that the moment you have an access to this networks, may it be Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or Ethernet, that or CAN, if you go into the technical part of it, or lean network, the moment you have an access to one, you are done. And most of the things you might have seen, the most public cases, let me take an example and give it to you. Jeep. It happened through the instrumentation cluster. You got an access, and once you get an access to CAN channels, they are interconnected, and then it's much easier for you to get in. So what you need to do as a designer, and that's what we are doing, is to make it incrementally difficult in every walk of life. So right the moment you design your controller, I talked about that BGA kind of packages. Even we as a designers, when we build it, that's it. To have an access, we have to break it apart to access any signal or stuff. That's the first thing. Then we need to harden all these networks. And some networks are known to be vulnerable for cyber attacks. So we try to avoid those networks at the first place. For example, in our vehicle, we never use Wi-Fi. That's the weakest link that you can find in this. So we avoid that kind of thing. We also make sure that our software is meeting certain coding standards. Since you are technical, I will go into the MISRA standards and CERT standards that you need to comply to make sure your software is robust. You also need to make sure every time software runs, it's basically checking its counterpart, and that is the hardware setting it in. We call it Hardware Trust Anchor, HTA. HTA is nothing but those, I'm sorry, I'm getting into technical, but that was the requirement of the question, so I have to. So once you get into HTA, HTA is a chip, is basically a kind of a password or some crypto code, but that code usually lies in the software code, and that is vulnerable. You should not have your password written in your diary, right? So you don't leave your password anywhere in your code. What you do is in the chip, and nowhere else. You just ask question, and it does its own assessment and crypto algorithms. It just gives you a different response. It's called challenge and response kind of thing. So we make this kind of assessment, gates at different levels to make it more and more difficult. Plus, when you ask question, you know that for that challenge, I need to get a response in 10 milliseconds. At 11th millisecond, if a response comes, you have to discard it because that's not my expected response. So I think there are hundreds and thousands of things that we do. On top of that, we do TARA analysis, that is threat analysis and risk assessment. That is done by all experts. Once that is done, we put the vehicle and give challenge to ethical hackers, and we do a penetration test, penetration and vulnerability test. So, and those hackers are basically incentivized if they can catch something. So I think these are the different things that we do to make it more and more difficult. Maybe after this discussion, I can get into even more deep discussions, but I think for this, are you happy with the answer? Okay, thank you.
Need a glass of wine to get to the real answer there. All right, any other questions? I'll let them pick.
Hi, name is Borg from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'd like to pose a question to, I guess, general question, whether or not, I guess the discussion pretty much focused like domestically and what people are doing and stuff and the future mobility here in Singapore. But could I pose a question about the future mobility, let's say in the ASEAN countries, and whether or not these firms have, or all of you have sort of interests in putting the future mobility in ASEAN countries as well? Thank you.
Who wants to do that? I mean, I just think they should turn it over to the Singapore government, but.
Well, I can take that as a ASEAN, as a company with operations in Southeast Asia. So definitely what I described in terms of Grab's vision for the future of mobility holds in all of Southeast Asia, perhaps even more so than in Singapore, given the state of transportation in some of these countries. With respect to whether autonomous vehicles would be the right types of vehicles to introduce in these countries, that's another question totally. Because if you think about readiness for autonomous vehicles, there are a lot more considerations that come into place in countries like Indonesia, where road regulations are followed very loosely. I think it would be almost impossible to imagine an autonomous vehicle operating with roads that could be functioning in one direction one day and something else another day. And when you think about the larger ecosystem to enable autonomous vehicles, you would also then need to get into the strength of regulations. How do you think about safety? And so the short answer is there's still quite some ways for these countries to go before they would be ready for autonomous vehicles.
Well, I think from the LTA standpoint, there are generally very strong interest in what we're looking at, urban mobility. I think there's a very good exchange with different countries. And I say this because, first of all, we're not just looking at it as an urban city, but we're also looking at how this can be cascaded across to the whole nation. And so, being small, well, at least in this instance, is advantageous to us, where you have urban city and a nation packed into one. They are able to probably share a bit more about what are our experience in trialing out this kind of technology. Autonomous vehicles is one, but I think Anna talked about electronic road pricing. Difficult policies to implement, but also then from a technology standpoint, how can we, make use of this electronic road pricing system, not just for charging, but also to in turn benefit the user in terms of sharing with them what is the traffic conditions out there, and hopefully avoid the congested areas. Although it may be slightly longer, but overall, you get to your destination faster. And so, when there is healthy exchange of views in terms of the context, in terms of how we deploy technology, how we use regulations, policies to help achieve certain intent, then everybody gain. And at the ASEAN level, in fact, last year we just hosted the ASEAN Transport Minister, and we did a showcase. We did a showcase across the three modes of transport, air, sea, and land. And for the land aspect, we share things like our centralized fleet management system for our buses, and how by enabling our buses to collect data, we help to improve the reliability of what are the bus arrival timings, and that in turn benefit the commuters. And not just in terms of the arrival timings, perhaps we can also share the loading of the buses and so on. So that's just one example of what future mobility can work on. If you then look at a broader topic of data analytics, well, there is another exciting field, I think, where there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of sharing.
Yeah. So if we imagine that the kind of technology and the infrastructure is kind of good to launch, say, tomorrow, we've kind of ironed out some of the security issues you mentioned. How close how close are governments to ironing out things like when it comes to liability or the ethical dilemmas between certain evasive actions and trying to weigh up those kinds of decisions? You know, are we close, or is it going to be some time before those kinds of things are sorted?
There are certain regulations that we have already put in place for vehicles on public roads. For example, having to have a third-party insurance, having to make sure that the vehicle is safe, and so on. And And when we bring in autonomous vehicles for trialing, we added additional features to help better create that safe environment. For example, for all the autonomous vehicles test or trial in Singapore, we require them to have a data logger. And the data logger will be able to record what are the actions taken by the vehicles. And for example, the test site that I've mentioned, the one-off test site that I've mentioned, we have also deployed additional features like DSRC beacons, additional CCTV, so that we can also have an overall view on how the vehicles are performing. And in fact, in time to come, some of the data will be piped into our operation control centers where we can then have an even better view on how the autonomous vehicles is performing. In terms of liability and accountability, I think it also, depending on the industries coming up, I understand there are certain motor OEMs, in fact, that have mentioned about having cover their vehicles if it's provisions with autonomous vehicles kit and all those. But on our front, we are constantly looking at what are the regulations that can first safeguard the safety and security, but at the same time, not stifle the industry, but also promote the use of technology so that everybody gain at the same time. It's a balancing act. It's not so straightforward. At the same time, we are also engaging different communities like the insurers, because better knowledge on the technology, better knowledge on how the autonomous vehicles are likely to be deployed will allow them to then structure some products that will help the overall usage of it.
Hi, my name is Ricky Willianta from this company called nuPlat. I really appreciate the discussion around the quality of mobility in the future. I'm curious to hear a little bit about the quantity of mobility. So my context is that nowadays people remote work a lot. There's video conferencing. There is eventually going to be virtual reality technology to basically keep people at home. So what are your perspectives on the quantity of mobility in the future? Thank you.
What do you mean by quantity? Like,
are people going to be more mobile? Are they going to stay at home more?
Oh.
Well, what we are looking at is there's a trend of a lot more diverse needs. First of all, in the Singapore context, we are still anticipating a population growth. And with the population growth, it means that we need to cater to a lot more needs to move the people and goods around. Second, we are also looking at very diverse needs in the form of, number one, we're going to see a lot more elderly. And it is not good if they are not socially active. And mobility then plays an important role. Promoting walking and cycling is a healthy way to get around. But if they need to move around over a longer distance, inclusive transport becomes an important one. And it may not be very high quantity per se, but the requirements of having different transport means catered to the individual needs then become an important one. So far, we are all talking about mobility as in just within transport, but actually transport is a lot also to do with urban planning. We work very closely with our urban planners, well, our colleagues from URA, HDBs, even commercial land planners like JTCs. And we work together because we are looking at how a land is developed to the maximum usage. And that's not just about catering to one need and then having to go to another need, thereby creating a trip. If possible, we would like to group them together and what we call work, live, play, and do whatever within that polycenter. While in a way, we reduce that need to move during peak periods, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are moving less. They are probably moving not all together at the same time. And that's wonderful for transport because infra-heavy sectors like transport have to cater for what we call a peak hour. A lot of resources are put in to cater to this peak hour, probably now. But after that, the resources are not that well used. In fact, during wee hours in the morning, it is hardly used. And so we are asking ourselves, can we make use of technology, maybe autonomous vehicles, maybe during wee hours in the morning, move the goods around, so that by the time we wake up and people got to move around, you have less of those cargo moving vehicles. And that's not just about the navigation. It is also about other parts, like creating the noise. If the noise signature is a lot higher during the wee hours in the morning, they will disrupt the sleep. And that's not very good for us. And then what about others, like not just in terms of noise, but overall control? Because not many people are working during wee hours in the morning. And so you have to look at the whole process chain. And that's where the future mobility is one where we are working very closely with other government agencies, working very closely with the industry to see whether we could process re-engineer a little bit and also cater to a larger part of it.
Good one. Do we have time for what, one more? Is it? All right, I think this will be the last one.
Yeah, probably I'm going to speak something different from the scene because as from the conversation conversations, my apologies, so far we are talking about land transport. So just a question for you guys. Are you guys are going to look at urban air transport in the future?
I think the government has to answer this one, right?
Wow. Yes, indeed, I was looking around. And why I was looking around is because, number one, the line is blurring. Well, I don't think we will have that traditional land transport service provider and aviation side. Just look at drones. There are drones used for cargo delivery, but if you search, there are also many passenger drones around. What stopped passenger drones from becoming some sort of urban aerial mobility carrier? And that means, from a regulation standpoint, it is no longer anything that moves on the land. LTA, Land Transport Authority, will take charge of it. Anything that fly, maybe our Civil Aviation Authority colleagues will be looking at it, but agreeing of it. Because who knows, maybe there's a flying car that travels for a certain distance and then they'll pick up as a passenger drones. But, well, that's why in the Ministry of Transport, we have this Futures Division. We cast our view a bit longer. And we ask ourselves, if this merge, what should we do? But the larger context is there's also a lot of economic value out there. There's a lot of opportunities. And the deployment of it is just one where, first, we have to balance the risk to encourage such innovation, but at the same time, be a little bit practical in terms of what the country needs and pursue those that can help address either our challenges or that can help advance, create good jobs, our economy better. And we are open and we are game to try it. And if you follow the news, Ministry of Transport just announced that coincidentally, One North again will also be a drone district.
And I can hear buzzing all the time when we go out to lunch in One North. Okay, I think that's it. We want to keep things to the time so people can break. You guys are fabulous. This is great. I'm sure we could do a few hours of this. It's quite an interesting topic. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, everyone. We have a very engaged audience here tonight. Can I invite the panelists to please stay on the stage while we get a photo? And you guys can network, and I believe you all will hang around for a little bit as well. Yeah, so you can approach them afterwards. Thank you.